So June 29th, Monday, we've got some cool quotes and reflections in the devotional that we looked at this morning. And for me, Acts chapter 13, verse 16, Paul is addressing the synagogue on the Sabbath, a synagogue in Pisidian Antioch, and he's invited to address, offer a word of exhortation to the synagogue. And so Paul stands up, motions with his hands, and says, "Fellow Israelites, and you Gentiles who worship God, listen to me." And I think it's just, for me, that stood out this morning. Again, when I read the scriptural texts that we have in our devotion, I kind of approach the texts in a lectio divina kind of a way, just waiting for a moment where a word or a phrase stands out to me, trusting that God is involved in that. And it was a good moment for me to reflect on the way that Paul is addressing the Jews and then also Gentiles who feared God, and this notion that the community of God is expansive, and it's ever expanding. And it started as this small Jewish community, but it transcended beyond that to, God-fearing Gentiles, and then the concept of God-fearing went beyond that, even to include those who acknowledge Jesus as King. And it's richer when the community of God enfolds tribes, tongues, and nations who call Jesus their King in a way that brings the rich diversity of humanity. It's better for it, right? And there's this reflection that started our devotion this morning, reflecting on Peter and Paul. And if Peter is the first pastor, the sort of shepherd after Jesus, of course, we're the first pastor of the church, right? Where Jesus says, "You're Peter, upon you, this rock, I will build my church." Paul, is sort of acknowledged as maybe the first theologian, because Peter was great, but wasn't formally educated. He was a fisherman, but had obviously unique leadership abilities as one of the people who walked closest with Jesus, and obviously was anointed and empowered by God's Spirit to do powerful and amazing things as an early leader of the church. But Paul, has this unique background in the sense that he had this very formal and very kind of high revered education under this famous rabbi Gamaliel, and so when Paul, who was Saul, right? So when Saul, this trained theologian in the Jewish tradition, when he encounters Jesus and converts and becomes Paul, as this newly convert to the way of Jesus, he has this background of understanding scripture and theology, and so Peter and Paul are these early pillars of the church that have remarkably different strengths and emphases. And so the reflection this morning I thought was really good. It says, one of the ways we see the wisdom of the early church is in their placing Peter and Paul's saint days together so that they have a shared celebration, thereby making sure there was no room for divisions over their leadership, even with their disagreements. There was no room for divisions over their leadership, even with their disagreements. Throw that one out there one more time. In a world that loves to disagree and dismiss each other because of disagreements. It may be that the church forgot this wisdom in the Reformation, with Rome claiming Peter's authority and Paul becoming the hero of the Protestants. Again, a good opportunity for us for some self-reflection as Protestants. we ain't perfect. Catholics ain't perfect. We're not perfect. Great, let's move forward together. The early church was quite clear that the first pastor and the first theologian of the faith had to be held in equal respect and an equal balance of authority. One without the other leaves us incomplete and unbalanced. What a great reflection of the sort of rich interdependence and array of the church community that needs to have this sort of back and forth, that needs people, as the early church expanded beyond just this Jewish enclave and had different tribes, tongues, and nations bringing in different experiences, and it didn't lessen the beauty of the church; it enhanced it, right? And we see that with Peter and Paul, this that they had disagreements and they had different emphases and gifts, but it made the church stronger, and we need both. And so our Archbishop Desmond Tutu had a great quote that was listed in the devotional this morning. Of course, he's the South African leader in the struggle against apartheid. He says, the first law of our being is that we are set in a delicate network of interdependence with our fellow human beings and with the rest of God's creation. And I think that's a great understanding of who we are as the church, as those called to love God with all of our being, and those called to love our neighbor as ourselves. And as we do that, as we see the ever expansive, ever expanding nature of God's church, his community here on earth as it is in heaven, I think we're called to lean into those tensions that we find and not run away from them. Amen.